I've had a church of 2,000 with wonderful, brilliant things that happened, but too many elements of what I'm talking about creeping into it, and it just doesn't work. And if I thought it would please God, I might try it, but I just think He's quite happy to let it go. So let's all just quit, all right? In fact, what I did one time when I was really depressed, I fired myself for an hour. I had a wonderful unemployed lunch, and then I hired myself again at 1 o'clock, but I felt much better, you know. So for the next 15 minutes, let's just fire ourselves, okay? And then we'll come back and we'll pick up the church again and maybe have a new viewpoint on it. I'm sorry. You guys make me feel so relaxed. I always speak longer. Actually, I speak longer anyway, but... So forgive me. I'm off pace here. I'm taking a little too long. So if you get bored, please, just don't shout anything, but you can just go off and enjoy yourself in the lobby or something. Okay. You never want to tell me I have lots of time. That's a dangerous thing. Okay. This next section is very unusual for me because I have 7 things that are very, very practical steps. That is not a method or a formula. It won't produce an end result, but 7 is a great number because it's sort of a godly number. But these are 7 things I would do if I started a new local church. And I wanted to keep at the absolute center sustaining a vision community over the long haul. Here's what I do, first of all. Evaluate. Now, I tell you that every time I come. You can't go anywhere until you know where you are. And yet in the church, we never want to know where we are. I know it's painful, but it's the beginning of hope. Where are you? And the way you can know where you are is start to hold up the kingdom plumb line and evaluate everything with it. Where is authentic discipleship in your church? Now realize that authentic discipleship isn't a fixed standard, it's a moving average. Because someone who just came off, I remember our son-in-law when he had just come to the Lord. He wasn't our son-in-law yet. But he was still dealing drugs, but he felt greatly convicted and wanted to start tithing on his earnings. That can be authentic discipleship. Can it not? Somebody who is still, everything is effing, right? But they start feeling guilty about using Jesus Christ's name in a negative way. That's authentic discipleship. Now, if it stays there over 10 years, it's a problem, right? So remember, it's just, are people moving? Are they stepping towards Jesus? Are they following Jesus? Oh, look at that. By some miracle. All right. Flesh and blood is not, no, flesh and blood did do this. So, evaluate. But evaluate too. What have you taught? Look back. What have you taught? What has been caught of what you're teaching? So use your friends to come in and examine. Use natural church development things. Create your own surveys. I mean, we used to do all sorts of surveys, asking people anonymously. Now, I would break down kingdom behavior, and I would say, what does that look like? Not just in church, but in a life. And then we'd ask people surveys, say, tell me honestly, how often do you do this? Do you ever share the good news about Jesus with anyone? How often do you do that? Have you prayed for somebody outside of a service in the last week, in the last month? I want to know, where are we? Because until you know where you are, what on earth do you do? What do you teach? Because you have to teach you have to create an invitation for where people are. Step number 1, all right? And don't skip it, or you'll just be throwing things out in the dark. Number 2, Based on what you know, you see, proclaim. Proclaim the kingdom invitation. Faith comes by hearing, right? Faith comes by hearing the message of the kingdom. And how is somebody going to hear it unless somebody says it? Now, I'm not saying here you need to have a boring lecture like today. You know, you can do this in a variety of ways. And whatever you do, make sure your proclamation is word and deed. Because the most powerful thing that people will ever hear is what you do. Some of you have been reading this book and talking to me about it today that I've sadly written. And but if you, those of you who read it, if I wrote those chapters and didn't add any of my stories, would it make a difference? It would. Because you read it and then you go, you know what? This guy's stupid, but he's stupid enough to do what he's talking about. And then it has some authority, doesn't it? I mean, why would you expect anyone in your church to do what you don't do? Right? So it all starts with you, don't you? Because you see, people do what they believe, and so do you. And so until you're doing what you're preaching, you don't believe it. So keep preaching. Keep preaching until you actually believe your message and start to do it. You know? So this thing of prophetic evangelism, I mean, Larry's preaching it all the time, right? So that he might believe it. And he is believing it. He is. He's walking it out. He's passionate about this thing, you see. He wants to do this thing personally. And so it has authority when he talks about it. It's always that. It's never anything else. And then you are calling others to it. It's always an invitation. Do you dare believe this? Do you dare believe it enough to step out and say to the waitress behind the counter, excuse me, do you have one leg shorter than the other? Huh? That's when you believe it. Not before. Before that, you're trying to believe it. Now, let me add one really important thing to pastors here. When you preach this, do not tell people what it means. Don't tell them what to do. Don't give them a solution. I think very often we create structures, hopefully, to help people begin to walk this out. And most often, we sell it far short. They never really wrestle with the thing and own it. We have two gals that are doing something absolutely brilliant. There's probably over 100 volunteers from North Langley Vineyard working with some of the poorest, most marginalized people. Spearheaded by two gals, one in the downtown east side, the poorest postal code in Canada, and then another one, a place where I grew up called Whalley in North Surrey, where all the Hells Angels are. And it's just tragic communities. And these two women have come there with a whole team of volunteers. And light is coming into darkness. It's an incredible thing. Long-term story. But we preached for years on God's heart for the poor and refused to tell anyone what that meant. We said, you tell me what it means to you. Back in the Langley Vineyard, we used to feed 1,500 people every month. In this next church, we refused to feed anybody. Instead, we said, you feed them. And we did more in the second church than in the first. Because people had to do it personally. They had to hear, what is God saying to me? Yeah. So, I mean, I had great pride in the fact we had this tremendous food bank, free store, this whole thing for the poor that was part of our church. And yet when that wasn't there, Joy and I had to figure out, what do we do? I mean, what do we do? And we've had to find a number of solutions that can fit with our life and our travel schedule and everything else. One thing we do is when we go down to down to Vancouver, we try to make sure we go down through a part of town that people don't like to go through.